Good afternoon. Welcome to the Full Scottish on Sunday, the 4th of February. My name is Brian Liddy, and today I've got two guests. I'm joined by Paul McLennan, SNP MSP for East Lothian, and also Minister for Housing. Welcome, Paul. And
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, yes, and
Joss.
yes, and Anthony Salamone. Anthony is a frequent guest here on Broadcasting Scotland. He's a leading Scottish political scientist, analyst, and thinker. And Anthony, you're managing director of the Director of European Merchants, the political analyst firm in Edinburgh. Welcome.
Thank you.
We'll start off again, sadly, with our routine Ukraine update on day 711. A Tu-95 bomber pilot has been shot in the Russian city of Engels, according to Ukraine's Military Intelligence Directorate, the GUR. The commander of the crew of the Tu-95 strategic bomber, Major Oleg Sergeyevich Stigachevov, was shot. I'll just move on. Was shot. He is directly involved. Forgive me for that appalling mispronunciation. He is directly involved in launching missile strikes on civilian objects in Ukraine and killing our people. The GUR said it was clarifying whether he survived. Remind you that retribution awaits all war criminals. We know your names, addresses, car numbers, usual routes and habits. More than 24 people, mostly journalists, were detained on Saturday at a protest in central Moscow, where wives and other relatives of Russian servicemen mobilized to fight in Ukraine called for their return, according to a Reuters witness and independent Russian news reports. Belgium is asking G7 countries to consider using €260 billion in seized Russian assets held by the West as collateral for loans to Ukraine, which would avoid questions around the legality of seizing the assets outright. In the US, Republicans in the House of Representatives have put forward a bill funding military aid to Israel, but pointedly excluding Ukraine. The US Senate has already put together a bipartisan compromise bill that covers Israel, Ukraine, and US-Mexico border security. Ukraine is close to signing security agreements with France and Germany, with text being finalised, according to the Ukrainian government. Russia said 20 people died after shelling of the Russian-occupied eastern Ukrainian city of Lysychansk. Ukrainian officials have not made any statement on the incident, but Ukraine has previously stated that it deliberately attacks only military sites, in contrast with Russia's indiscriminate bombing of civilians. Poland's president, Andrzej Duda, has rowed back from a statement he made on Saturday in which he cast doubt over Ukraine's ability to retake Crimea. The actor Milos Bikovic has been dropped from the cast of popular TV series The White Lotus, according to the HBO network, after the Serbians' ties to Russia drew rebukes from Ukraine. 2 Ukrainian drones struck the largest oil refinery in southern Russia on Saturday. Local authorities in Russia said a fire broke out at the Volgograd refinery of the Lukoil company. Ukraine's air defences downed 9 of 14 Russian drones in an attack on Saturday morning that hit energy infrastructure in the city of Kryvyi Rih, the Air Force and regional officials said. Paul, I'll come to you first. First of all, apologies for my appalling mispronunciations. Usually I cast my eye over the Ukrainian update before I come on air to look for difficult to pronounce names, but you can still tell it today. I didn't manage to do that. But was there anything in today's update that caught your eye?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's obviously Russia's involvement, and I know we'll be talking about Gaza at the moment. Russia's involvement in the wider Middle East issue, obviously, writ large as well. And I think obviously what you said about the Polish statement and about Ukraine retaking Crimea, I think the moment that we're at a state of stalemate, and that's probably in terms of the wider geopolitical position at the moment. And there's not enough peacekeeping going on. I know we'll touch on that when it comes to Gaza, but we're in much of a stalemate, I think, in terms of where the Ukrainian-Russian situation as well. And I think there needs that broader rethink around about what we need to do to move things on in terms of that. But I think it would be extremely difficult for Ukraine to retake Crimea. But I suppose that's the one thing that kind of stuck out for me.
Thank you, Paul. And Anthony, was there anything that you'd like to elaborate on from the Ukraine update?
Well, I suppose this question of what to do with Russia's assets that have been frozen, mainly in the European Union, the US, and countries like the UK and Switzerland, is one that's quite salient and it's been gaining traction over recent weeks. These were sort of frozen and sort of seized early in the war. And if my understanding is correct, sort of the interest that's been accrued from those assets has sort of been reallocated, but the assets themselves haven't been touched, and countries, particularly in the EU, have been reluctant to do so for fear of the precedent that it would set, both in that it might damage confidence in currencies like the euro and the dollar in terms of other central banks or states, and that they might sort of switch to other countries like China, or indeed, of course, that their own sort of reserves elsewhere in the world might also be seized in future. But nevertheless, as with much of the response to Russia's war on Ukraine, countries start from a position of reluctance and then end up agreeing on sort of the original proposal in some form or another anyway. So I think this is definitely one to watch because it will be very expensive for Ukraine to rebuild itself. It will need a lot of money. There is no sort of realistic prospect at this point of Russia voluntarily contributing to that, obviously, and yet there are billions of dollars being held by the EU, the US, and others, which could be used for that reconstruction, or indeed to ensure Ukraine's sort of continuity right now. And we'll have to see what happens there because that's a crucial question.
Yes, I think that it could be huge. So I'll move on then to the situation in Gaza. So while Qatar-led talks on a ceasefire in Gaza, while Qatar-led talks on a ceasefire in Gaza continue, the US and UK launched more airstrikes on Yemen, and the death toll in Gaza has reached 27,238 Palestinians killed and 66,452 injured since the 7th of October. I imagine that those figures would include people buried under rubble and missing, presumed dead. As thousands across the UK march in support of a ceasefire, what is the risk of the conflict escalating? Anthony, I'll come to you first on that one. What are your thoughts?
So it's hard to tell at this point what sort of the medium term to long term prospect for the regional conflict is. You would like to think that none of the parties involved want to see things get any worse than they already are or spread in terms of armed conflict. But I suppose one of the core differences that's worth highlighting this time around, as opposed to other bouts of violence in the Middle East, is the role in which local actors can play, hopefully in a positive way. We often think of countries like, well, mainly the United States, but also other external actors as playing a role, for better or worse, in shaping what happens in the Middle East. And of course, that includes the UK historically as well. But now we're in a different situation here where Saudi Arabia, where the UAE, where Qatar and others clearly have a role to play, both in mediating in some instances between the parties, but also in playing a more decisive role in trying to find a longer term solution to these conflicts. Where it makes sense. So, for instance, in the case of between Israel and Gaza, obviously, in terms of Yemen, Saudi Arabia and others are involved, so less able to play a role of some sort of broker. But nevertheless, to see local regional involvement is really the best way forward, because even with best intentions, it's not as if the United States or anyone could sort of solve this all on their own. There's a long road to eventual peace and stability in Gaza, in Yemen, and in other parts of the Middle East. Everyone will have to play their part.
Thank you, Anthony. Paul, I'm just wondering, as you're an MSP and sitting in Holyrood, have there been any debates in the Chamber about Gaza that you've taken part in, and maybe with specific reference to the risk of escalation?
Yeah, I mean, I think when the conflict started, there was a debate in the Parliament, obviously, where the Parliament, everybody apart from the Tories, decided to support a ceasefire, and I think that's still the case across the Parliament. and it's supported by all parties. Obviously, Labour were exposed for supporting it in Scotland, but not so much in the UK. But just to pick up on the point, I think that Anthony made, I think in terms of Qatar, the UAE, and others, there's a peacekeeping role. But I think what's different and probably more worrying about this particular conflict is it's really reignited some regional tensions and pressures that are there. We just look around about the recent bombings where Iraq and Syria have been involved. Iran is obviously a proxy player all the way through this, and have been using proxies to look at that. We look at the Saudi Yemen conflict, where obviously the Houthis are obviously trying to put more pressure on the UK and US governments in terms of this. Obviously, you still got the situation with Turkey and the Kurds. And again, I think Turkey is taking advantage of that. And I think that's the more worrying aspect. I think it's a tinderbox at the moment. And I'll come back to that in a little second. In terms of Israel and Gaza, the situation with Hamas, the only way to get out of this is a two-state solution. And I just wish there was more efforts from the governments, whether it's the US, UK, and the external, as I said, Qatar and UAE, looking at some kind of regional peace discussions and being serious about it this time. All these conflicts are all tied up to each other. It's not going to take much for one unfortunate incident or one mistake to possibly look at a wider conflict in terms of that. So, yes, we need to look at a two-state solution. That's the only way between Israel and Palestine going ahead. But we need to look at the other regional conflicts that are going on at the moment and trying to pick up these as well, because it's a tinderbox at the moment, and all these conflicts are related. And the problem is, at the moment, it's hard when they're using proxies and not, from their own countries as such. So it becomes really difficult in terms of that. And of course, we've then got the added possibility of a Donald Trump presidency later on this year and the start of next year. So if I was UK government, I would certainly be pushing for a regional peace summit in terms of looking at some of these issues. We need to calm it down. At the moment, all we seem to be seeing is more bombings, more conflict, more people dying, most importantly, more people dying. But the economic cost of this as well is terrible. But we're talking around about the number of people alone killed in Gaza. It's terrible. It's absolutely terrible. We need to be doing something more towards about peace rather than just out and out war that we're seeing at the moment.
Thank you, Paul. So the next item on our running order is the UK COVID inquiry. If the purpose of a public inquiry is to gather evidence from documents and witness testimonies, so the inquiry can conclude what went wrong and what went well, and make recommendations for future conduct, why did the UK COVID inquiry, sitting in Edinburgh this week, seem more like a show trial as Jamie Dawson QC cross-examined Nicola Sturgeon as if she was on trial? Paul, as you're somebody, I mean, you know Nicola Sturgeon, you've worked with her for a number of years now. How did you feel, or what did you think when you were watching her time at the COVID inquiry this week?
Yeah, I think the most important part is to look at the context of what the inquiry was set up to do. And I think the Scottish Government are probably going to have put themselves forward, has been open to inquiries. Obviously, there's a UK Government inquiry. The Scottish Government intended and will have its own Scottish Government inquiry. So it's been open and transparent around about that. The Welsh Government and Northern Ireland Executive haven't gone down that particular route. So, I think that knocks back around about the situation by being open and transparent. And there was more of a focus. I think the inquiry should be looking at decisions that were made, what lessons are to be learned, and make sure if that happens again, we're in the best position possible to solve that. What there seemed to be was more on personalities. And, we've seen the attacks on Nicola Sturgeon for what I thought was meant to be a balanced inquiry, which I think were totally unfair. And also focusing on some of how were messages transmitted. And being a minister, I think one of the key things, I think for me, any decision I make has to be recorded and goes through a formal process. I can't make decisions on WhatsApp, for example. It has to go through all minutes. All meetings are minuted, and in terms of any decisions, it has to go through a formal process. So there seemed to be more of a focus on personality, more of a focus on how were decisions, I suppose, transmitted. The key thing that I've not taken out of this so far is what lessons have been learned, and every government made mistakes. We've not had to deal with a pandemic before. What decisions were made? Why were the decisions made? And what were the lessons to take from that? And then if you look at the press, there was no focus on that whatsoever. Now, we know we don't have a balanced press in Scotland in terms of that, but I can't see what lessons were picked up from the inquiry, from the discussions we've had so far around about what decisions were made and why and what we learned from it. I know the inquiry will be reporting later on this year, towards the end of the year, but the way it was handled and personalised, I don't think was fair. And when you compare that with looking at Michael Gove or Alistair Jack, it's completely different. Not just the way it was handled by the UK government inquiry, but also by the press, who seemed to ignore the same issues that Alistair Jack had in terms of deleting all his WhatsApp messages. So completely unfair. The key things we should be learning is what are the decisions and why, and the lessons we need to learn. And there should be more of a focus on that.
Thanks, Paul, for bringing up WhatsApps. It's definitely something that I'd like to discuss today before we move on to the next item, because the First Minister, as you said, that they're all the WhatsApps have been deleted, but the important information is recorded elsewhere, and yet we don't seem to be getting those elsewhere. These places where the information is recorded doesn't seem to be getting referred to at all. There's too much concentration on just the WhatsApps. And Anthony, I got the impression, I don't know if you had the same impression, that Nicola Sturgeon was making a contribution to the COVID inquiry, that if it had been a legal trial and she had a team of lawyers by her side, they would have been constantly standing up and raising objections. Did you have a similar impression from when you watched it?
Perhaps, indeed. I agree with Paul that the focus of the inquiry both is and should be making sure that we learn lessons to ensure that we're as prepared as possible for when a pandemic comes in future. The purpose of the inquiry is not to study how Nicola Sturgeon or the Scottish Government operate as a general principle, even if there are elements that could be improved upon. And I think that is the way in which this Nicola Sturgeon's evidence, and indeed sort of the wider role of the Scottish Government trying to manage the pandemic, have been filtered through in most of the press, which is to draw parallels to other sort of items of supposed interest on how the Scottish Government was run. That's not the purpose of the inquiry. It's really important to find out what are the core lessons for how we can do better next time. And to certainly probe decisions that were made, but there's little good in trying to blame particular people, not least given the extraordinary pressures put on politicians, civil servants, and others to deal with a situation that, frankly, we probably weren't really prepared for, and certainly never really expected to have to deal with. It was challenging for everyone, for people in the Scottish Government and UK Government, and frankly everywhere else in the world. It's quite easy in hindsight to point out obvious failings or errors, but at the time it was an extremely challenging environment, and I think that's been borne out in the evidence that we've seen to the inquiry so far. And it's not the focus to consider sort of the general culture disposition of the Scottish Government. It's about trying to understand how and why decisions were made as a general principle, but then to understand as the core element from that what to do better next time.
Thank you, Anthony. Paul, it seemed that instead of concentrating on what the Scottish Government did well during the pandemic and maybe didn't do so well or got wrong during the pandemic, Jamie Dawson's, I don't know if you saw it, but he had an extraordinarily lengthy number of questions for Nicola Sturgeon, concentrating on her instincts and questioning her instincts all the way. So I've got a wee list here that he said that she made decisions based on her instincts around the Eurofan zone, which was her instinct was to cancel it. Claimed that her instinct was to seek to create difference between the UK government rather than collaborative strategy. Claimed that her instinct was to move away from existing structures such as Cobra and SAGE. Claimed that her instinct was to be seen to follow a different path from the UK government and to get her word in first in public, that Nicola Sturgeon's instinct was to keep decision-making secret and how decisions were reached, recorded and detained. Claimed that Sturgeon's instinct was that she knew best, rendering public strategies and advisory structures to around her to be rhetoric, and it was her instinct to seek to be portrayed as open and honest with the public, but at the same time keep from the public important elements of the management of things like the Nike conference and care home deaths, which allowed COVID into Scotland in the first place. That's paraphrasing, but that's pretty much what he said. Can somebody question another person's instincts?
No, and I think we've touched on this already. If there was a legal team around about the former First Minister at that stage, I think obviously that would be stopped. That line of questioning would be stopped. You can't quiz that in terms of any decisions. And again, it's coming back to the point around about why your decisions made and the reasoning behind that. So raising that on a number of occasions wouldn't be permitted in a normal trial, and it seemed to be like a normal trial. And I think QC or KC now obviously took advantage of that I think for political reasons. In terms of that, so I don't think that that's fair, and it does come back to yeah, and I think that's I think they took advantage of that, and I think, as I said, for political reasons, and it does come back. If there's a reporting, I suppose, of the inquiry, it can't report on people's instincts. In terms of course, there need to be decisions made for situations we've never been in before, because that's where we are. And again, the preparedness, I think, for such a pandemic, I think obviously would be something that needs to be looked at, not just in how we dealt with it, but our preparedness for another one coming in, the preparedness we had before. So, and it comes back to the way it was handled in the contradictory questioning. I think when you looked at Alistair Jack and Michael Goverand about what were their instincts, and and again, I think it's been unfortunately, to say the least, the way this has been handled. It shouldn't be political in any way, shape, or form, but this one obviously has been.
Thank you, Paul. And Anthony, we've touched on the fact that surely the COVID inquiry should be to find out what went wrong and what went well. Sir Ian Diamond found that in Wales, or he raised the point that age standardised mortality rates are a better measure of mortality than just blanket mortality figures for an entire nation, a bit like the 100,000 per population figures. And Sir Ian Diamond found that in Wales there were 144.6 people who died of COVID out of 100,000. In Northern Ireland there were 130.7 out of 100,000. England had the highest rate at 145, and Scotland had the lowest at 124.9 per 100,000. So it seems that if you lived in Scotland under the Scottish Government during the pandemic, you were more likely to survive. Is that fair to say?
Well, that's out with my area of expertise. I'm not a public health expert and just a political scientist and analyst. I think that it's, as I say, it's easier with hindsight to look back and try to compare one set of decision makers versus another. I think it's important we try to see how we can learn as many lessons as we can for the future. And I think that inquiries like this would benefit from making sure that everyone involved has a clear understanding of devolution, for instance, and how intergovernmental relations work in the UK. I'm not saying whether or not the stakeholders behind this inquiry do or don't, but I think that it's hard to fully assess how decisions were made between and within the different governments and parts of the UK without fully taking into account the politics of the UK. Which is to say that while it was very important that the different administrations of the UK could work together wherever possible, each was also responsible for health and public policy, and have been for some time. And so this point about there being differences in some respects between Scotland or England or Scotland and the rest of the UK as a whole is, in my view, probably just a reflection of the fact that public health has been devolved for over 20 years, and particularly on the point of saying that the Scottish Government wanted to be different just for the sake of it. Everything that I was able to see at the time doesn't support that. I don't think that that's quite true at all. I don't believe that the Scottish Government was in any decisions that it was making during the pandemic were doing them just to be different from the rest of the UK. I think that it was on the basis of trying to make what they believed were the best decisions at the time, and where they were aligned with what was happening in England, they were, and where they weren't. And that was just the way of trying to navigate through a very difficult situation.
Thank you, Anthony. Paul, you mentioned that it's going to take a few years before we get the final conclusion from this inquiry, but if we go back to Module 1, which was in September 2023, I've got a closing statement on behalf of the TUC here. I'm just going to read out a bit of it and see if you what your thoughts are and see if you concur. It says that the narrative suggested by some, such as Mr Johnson, of the devolved administrations, I think Mr Johnson's Boris Johnson, of the devolved administrations cynically seeking difference for the sake of political advantage does not withstand scrutiny. Different approaches appear to have a sound basis rooted in public health and reflect well under the scrutiny of hindsight, including A, Scotland banning large events at an earlier stage, B, Scotland taking an approach to face mask guidance in schools consistent with the World Health Organisation, and C, Wales deciding in October 2020 that firmer action was needed and implementing a fire break. Does that kind of ring true to your time in Holyrood during the pandemic?
Yeah, and I think it does, because I think there is a political element, as Anthony had said. I think, this is almost an attack on devolution. That this is up to each individual government to make their decisions based on their own circumstances in their own country, and I think that should have always been the case. And because there was disagreement or in terms of how that was, I suppose, managed within the current devolved settlement, it doesn't mean one country was right and one country was wrong. And I think the figures will show that Scotland performed more strongly than others in terms of the number of people that died and the number of people, obviously, per 100,000. But I think it does touch on, and I think there's an element of, obviously, political, I suppose, those who are against devolution having a go at that particular point of view. But it does come back. I think there's a few other things in terms of that. We remember the situation that it comes back to the point I mentioned around about Scotland has set itself up for its own public inquiry. It's been as open and transparent as possible. And Nicola Sturgeon was up there every day speaking to the press around about that and quizzed on this every single day. And yet we had opposition people, spokesperson, both Douglas Ross and Jackie Bailey, for example, saying it was too much. And so, on one hand, we have the opposition talking around about it wasn't open and transparent. And when Nicola Sturgeon was open and transparent during the daily broadcasts, they wanted her to stop. So again, there's political opportunism, I think, in play at here. And I said, Scotland has been open and transparent. Is there lessons to be learned? Of course there is. But Scotland has been open and transparent about this, and you can't take attacks from opposition politicians who then didn't want the daily broadcasts coming from the First Minister at that stage. So yeah, there is political opportunism, and I regret that. That's not going to help the people who need the answers that will come from the inquiry.
Thank you, Paul. We've got a couple of minutes left on this item. Jamie Dawson, Casey, I think I said QC earlier, apologies for that. Some of his questioning of Nicola Sturgeon seemed to give him quite a good insight into what it was like with her advisory team. But it seemed to me that there was almost an element of either sexism or misogyny. I don't know if either of you might have picked up on that either. It seemed that a lot of the older white male advisors had a problem with the likes of Professor Devi Sridhar and Calderwood and Jean Freeman and probably Nicola Sturgeon themselves. And the Dawsons spent a long time going on to what seemed like personal politics within the team. Anthony, I suppose it's your turn. Did you get any kind of hint of misogyny coming across?
I have to be honest in saying I didn't watch the full hearing, so I'm afraid I didn't see those questions, or so I can't really say. I think I would just come back to what I was sort of elaborating on before, which is that it's right to probe sort of how decisions were made or who was making them and so on. But I think it's important to avoid dissecting people or attributing blame or assuming that processes were going to be perfect in a very difficult situation. In a challenging, unprecedented situation where people were forced to make extremely important decisions based on, in some cases, relatively little information and very little time to decide what was right. Yes, we should try and learn what we can from it, but it's important not to sort of be quick to judge the decisions that were made and the way in which they were made, given the very challenging, difficult, and unique circumstances that everyone was faced with at the start of this pandemic.
Thanks, Anthony. Paul, just quickly before we move on, how was Nicola Sturgeon's contribution received in Holyrood? Did you have a chance to talk to your colleagues there, and did they detect any note of misogyny or sexism?
Yeah, I suppose, yeah. I mean, there has been concern. I think about the way this has been handled. It's not your normal. I know the public inquiry is different, but there isn't the same level of public attack on people's instinct, for example. I think there was an element of political opportunism from not just opposition, but from, I think, the inquiry itself. But there was also misogyny. You just have to look at, for example, about how Alistair Jack was questioned, how Michael Gove was questioned, and some of the statements he made. Nowhere near the same level of I suppose, focus on instinct, for example. There's one prime example. So there was an element of misogyny, which unfortunately is still about in UK politics, and and we've still got much work to be doing on that. So yeah, I think it was seen to be not balanced, and certainly that's my opinion. It wasn't balanced in terms of the level of questioning. Of course, the former first minister has to be questioned, but in terms of the comparisons between those and the questionings of Nicola Sturgeon and Alistair Jack, for example, completely different. Covered both in the inquiry and through the press. So, you will hope that that in future sessions, that will be picked up. That will change, because in the way it's been carried out so far, it's not been an equitable position, let's say.
Thank you, Paul. So the next item is Brexit, which is now 4 years old. It's 4 years since the UK left the EU, and the UK economy has taken a battering and has regularly been the worst performing of the G7 economies. 42% of UK products previously exported to the EU have disappeared from shops there. So we're wondering, are there any sunlit uplands or just storm-bound ports? I couldn't help thinking of it. So it was the 31st of January 2020 when the UK officially left the EU. So Brexit's 4 years old. It's its fourth birthday, or it was its fourth birthday. And for its birthday, it was given some presents, which included a 24-page glossy brochure from the Tory government, the Department of Business and Trade, and its other birthday presents seem to have been price increases and new border checks as plant and animal imports, which have been postponed 5 times by Westminster, are starting now. Anthony, you're an expert on the EU. Did you manage to cast an eye over the government's report, 24-page? It's not a report; it's a 24-page glossy brochure.
I'm afraid I didn't read the promo piece, but I think we could maybe guess what was in it anyway, which is just sort of suggested that Brexit is a wonderful opportunity for the UK to forge some independent, free trading spirit around the world or something. All of which is obviously not true. The UK traded when it was part of the EU, and in fact traded both with all the other members of the European Union and of course with all the other countries of the world. Just as other EU member states do. Germany being sort of the record exporter historically of the European Union, straight at the heart of the EU. Trade is possible as an EU member state, and of course it's worse for the UK now, given that while trade is reduced, nevertheless the EU is a hugely important trading partner for the UK and always will be, given our geographic proximity and other levels of interconnection. But of course, one of the only core focus of Brexiteers has been on trade, and as I and others have no doubt said on this program, and many times before, being part of the European Union is not just about trade and economics, though those are quite important. It's about every other aspect of working together in the world, from cooperation on the environment and climate change through to defense and security, geopolitics, facing all of the obvious challenges that the rest of Europe is facing, from climate change, from Russia, from geopolitical instability. It's about working together and pretending that we don't need to work with our closest neighbors and friends is somehow a great strategy for reinventing the UK, is as superficial as it sounds.
Thank you, Anthony. Paul, I've got something here. Boris Johnson tweeted on January the 31st about Brexit freedoms that have been introduced to improve standards of animal welfare. He said, "We must at all costs avoid a return to anything remotely like the disastrous Chequers formula, whereby artificial concerns about the border between Northern Ireland and Ireland are used to keep the whole of the UK in alignment with EU rules. I don't know. I should really just. What did you think of Brexit's 4th birthday?
Again, the most startling thing is, even if you ask the most ardent Brexiteers what the benefits of Brexit have been, they will struggle. They will absolutely struggle because there's been none. I think in terms of trade, we're weaker, in the UK and in Scotland, considerably weaker. In terms of the UK's geopolitical position, it's considerably weaker, not just because of Brexit, but for some of the policies that have been carried out in terms of that. In terms of environmental standards that Anthony touched upon, and science, for example, we are considerably weaker. And I just have to look at my own constituency, for example, and the impact that that's had. Lots of businesses I've spoken to had established markets that they've now lost, which they won't get back because initially because of some of the teething problems, but on an ongoing basis, trade is incredibly hard. In terms of the freedom of movement, we have many sectors: the care sector, the hospitality sector, which had people from other parts of Europe over here now who can't open on a full-time basis because they don't have the staff, and that's been caused by Brexit. And I think, and Anthony might correct me if I'm wrong here, I think that the estimate of people leaving the UK because Brexit was 1.5 million people. If you take that down to Scotland, you're talking probably 150,000, and these are crude figures. If you can taking it down to my own constituency, you're talking about 2,000 or 3,000 people that's been lost because of that, and that's made a dramatic difference in terms of that. So I can't see any benefits whatsoever, and even our most ardent Brexiteers will tell you that. And so it's been the disaster I think we all thought it would be for a political experiment that went wrong. First of all, with David Cameron, and then obviously with Boris Johnson and Liz Truss and so on. So no benefits, and I think it comes back to the whole politics about it. We have a Labour Party now which doesn't, which won't even look at freedom of movement, which supports the current Brexit position, and won't look to go back in because they're scared to, I suppose, rock the boat sort of thing. So we need to get back into Europe for all the reasons I've talked about, and that's again, if it's one of the key reasons for independence, is around about Scotland rejoining the EU, which I think would be received with welcome open arms. But it's been a disaster. There's no other way around about it.
Thanks for bringing up Labour there, Paul. I was going to ask you because I think Angela Rayner was in your constituency recently with her tartan Doc Martens. Did she swing by and say hello?
No, she didn't. She didn't say hello. We usually get notified if there's other politicians coming in. So we got notified the day or two before, and I think she was with Douglas Alexander, who's obviously new to East Lothian, came across from Paisley, doesn't even live in East Lothian. And I know the situation that's raised in the Parliament quite a lot around about Brexit and Labour's position on Brexit. They can't defend it. They know they can't defend it. And there are Labour MSPs who I know because I've spoken to them and they speak to us, who's very uncomfortable with that position. But the decision's not theirs. It's Keir Starmer's decision. He doesn't want to upset Middle England by possibly talking about going back into Europe. So I know that's a situation. Yeah, and just as you said, I mean, Angela Rayner coming up with the tartan boots, it's condescending and patronising, to say the least. It's like the last time, I think, when Jeremy Corbyn came up, he was pictured with a bottle of Iron Brew. So, yeah, the less said about that, the better, I think.
Yes. So, Anthony, I've got quite a simple question for you, but I'm hoping that you'll be able to give us an excellent answer. I mean, I've got lots and lots of notes here about covering things like the Chequers formula and the Windsor framework, and how Brexit's affected things like food labelling and recent changes coming in that. But we often say that "get Brexit done." That phrase, "get Brexit done." Is Brexit done yet?
A simple answer, maybe not. It depends on what you mean by that, I guess. Clearly the UK is out of the EU, and unfortunately there's no easy way back. Now that the Brexit is over in the sense of realized, which is what I would normally say, rather than being over. If the UK ever wants to rejoin the EU, will have to apply from scratch and go through the normal sort of fairly long EU accession process. Which obviously it would is a lot more complicated than having never left the EU to begin with. Is Brexit over in the sense of the UK sort of adapting to the new realities? Well, no, I don't think so. It can be challenging to measure the consequences, the overwhelmingly negative consequences of Brexit. Sometimes for different reasons. One was that the UK's sort of phased departure from the EU took place in part during the pandemic, and sometimes it was hard to distinguish were these economic and other consequences because of the pandemic or because of Brexit. Clearly, that's not as much of an issue. Well, it's not as an issue now. But also, so much about the EU is removing barriers and borders. And so, when you're trying to quantify the costs of Brexit, sometimes it's not about, things you can easily look at. It's just about things that never happened that otherwise could have happened. So, trading opportunities that could have formed but didn't, businesses that could have been created by, EU citizens moving to Scotland or other parts of the UK that were never established, relationships or friendships that were never formed because people weren't going on Erasmus exchanges. Those things are difficult to quantify, but they are very important, can have huge benefits, and are, core reasons why it makes sense to be part of the EU. So, is Brexit over in terms of the consequences for us? No. But, it's a challenge to see how, the UK as a whole can move, back towards regaining what was lost. And I suppose it's worth keeping in mind that what was lost was given up voluntarily by the UK government, and it's still as regrettable today as it was on the day in which the UK left the EU.
Thank you, Anthony. Paul, we haven't really said much about what the actual changes that are going to happen on the fourth birthday and the fourth anniversary. I'm thinking about food labelling that's going to be brought in, and also just the fact that, correct me if I'm wrong, Anthony, when the UK left the EU started to put in border checks for goods going from Britain into the EU. And now, 5 years later, or after five cancellations, postponements, the UK is now going to have to put in similar reciprocal food checks at borders. So is it what I'm trying to get at is, you work in Holyrood. We keep hearing about how Holyrood is having to mitigate Westminster policies. Is there a cross-party committee, perhaps, or some kind of body that's looking at Brexit and how it's affected, and how Holyrood can mitigate the effects of Brexit?
Yeah, I mean, I was just in a discussion last week with cabinet secretaries and ministers talking around about alignment with EU policies. Even though we're not in the EU, I think it's still important, and I think it was the economy committee that had looked at that and asked for ministers and cabinet secretaries to have a look at that. So there's a piece of work that gets carried out around about legislation in Europe, which obviously impacts on legislation here in Scotland. So even though we're not part of the EU, regrettably, I think there is a piece of work that's underway and will continue in terms of, are we realigned to, is there a proper realignment in terms of policies in Europe or initiatives in Europe? And I think we need to be looking at that. One, obviously for trade, but two, in other terms around about science or environment and so on. So we need to be realigned as much as we possibly can in terms of that. And I think that piece of work will continue. There's been a number of debates in Parliament, just one in just last week, talking around about the impact of Brexit, and that's still discussed. And you see the unease of the Tories trying to defend it. Labour are in a very in a sticky position when it comes to that, and you've even got the situation that the self-proclaimed Europhiles and Lib Dems, even can't defend it. So that's that it's not in a good position. They can't defend it. They can't defend it whatsoever. So that I think will continue. There'll still be debates, and it's still impacting Scotland as we speak.
Thank you, Paul. So I'll move on to our next item, which is Northern Ireland. And I've just lost track of my running order. Okay, so Northern Ireland has become the UK's only safe port in the Brexit storm. However, does the historic significance of Michelle O'Neill becoming the first Irish nationalist First Minister reveal higher aspirations than the best of both worlds? I think this is a reference to the possibility of a reunited Ireland. Anthony, do you think the new First Minister, Salamone, who's from Sinn Féin, the Sinn Féin party, is this a step sorry, Michelle O'Neill? I'm terrible with names. At the best of times, but even more so when I'm sat in this chair. So Michelle O'Neill from the Sinn Féin party is now First Minister in Northern Ireland. She's going to have to share power with a deputy First Minister, but they're both equal. They both have equal authority, and all decisions are going to be taken on a joint basis. It looks like both the First Minister and the Deputy First Minister are going to be women. But Anthony, do you think, is this a step towards the reunification of Ireland?
I wouldn't go that far at this stage. It's important to see that the executive, has been reestablished after such a long period of non-existence, because the whole way the political settlement in Ireland is set up is that parties from the Unionist and the Republican tradition have to work together to form a government and to make the executive and the assembly work. And people in Northern Ireland, just like people everywhere else, need a government and need a parliament to make decisions and to deliver policies for them. So it's great that is happening again after a long period of time. You're quite right, Brian, that the titles, while they can be symbolically significant, have little practical consequence, because Michelle O'Neill was Deputy First Minister before. Now she's First Minister. Now the First Minister and Deputy First Minister are otherwise equal. In fact, there has been discussion over the years about renaming the titles to make it clear that both people have equal authority. Of course, it is significant that the Sinn Féin Republican Party was the largest in the last Assembly election. Yes, of course, but I think it's worth stepping back and remembering that the question of reunification between Northern Ireland and Ireland is one which is complex, which of course involves actors in Northern Ireland and obviously engages the rest of the UK as well, but is one for people in Ireland too. And while there's clear majority support within Ireland for reunification, yes, there are lots of it's quite interesting the extent to which the sort of the practical elements of that have in large measure not been explored, right? And if you were really interested in seeing how reunification would go about, you'd be thinking about the political and policy roots to that, the financial costs and who would pay for them and so on. And there's some work has been done on that, of course, but just maybe not as much debate and discussion as you'd expect if that were to happen, in the near future, for instance. And I think there's probably also a recognition with Sinn Féin in Northern Ireland that there's no immediate prospect of either a border pull or reunification. And if they want to achieve those things, first of all, people will be looking to their new record in government in Northern Ireland, and obviously the prospect of Sinn Féin potentially entering government in Ireland after the next election there. So their record in government in both jurisdictions is one, but also how do they address the concerns of unionists? Because if you want to secure majority support in Northern Ireland, of course you need to secure majority support in Ireland as well for reunification. You need to convince people who are either of neither tradition or who are unionist that either that is the right outcome or the best outcome for them, or that in the event of reunification that they will be accommodated, that their sort of their identities and rights as they see them will be preserved. I think there has been a greater emphasis by Sinn Féin in recent years to acknowledge that, even though they haven't changed their own political persuasions. And I think that's the core point to watch. How will Sinn Féin or indeed other Republican parties seek to reassure unionists that their political vision can accommodate them as well?
Thank you, Anthony. Paul, Anthony alluded to the 2022 Assembly election. That's when Sinn Féin became the largest party in Northern Ireland for the first time, and that's when the DUP started to boycott the Assembly in Stormont. Mary Lou McDonald's, she's not as cautious as you when it comes to the possibility of a reunified Ireland. She said it's the ultimate goal of Irish unity is now within touching distance. But Paul, Yeah, the fact that 2 years. I mean, can you imagine the Holyrood if Holyrood had been closed for 2 years? So what does it mean now?
Yeah, first of all, I still think it shows the restrictions of the devolved setup, which is still very strongly unionist right across the UK. I think it is a significant step in terms of towards Irish unification, which I'm happy to see. I agree with Anthony. I think one of the key things will probably be the next elections that are held. If Sinn Féin are in government, both in the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, I think there will be a strong push for a border poll. And of course, that's written into the Good Friday Agreement, something that in Scotland we would have loved to have had after our own referendum. So I think there will be real increasing pressure on the UK government and Irish government toward the border poll if that was the case. And I hope it does then move towards a reunified Ireland. I appreciate the points that Anthony said. There's a lot of work to be done in terms of that, beyond that, before that and beyond that. What does it look like? How do they protect the traditions of the unionist, I suppose, people in Northern Ireland? I think there's a lot of work that can be done in that, and I would hope that both UK government, the Northern Ireland executive, the UK government, and the Republic of Ireland will be looking at that and doing some work in the background because they have to prepare for that. And I think one key thing as well is in terms of the demographics around about the Catholic, what used to be a Catholic minority and who traditionally support the nationalists. And there now is the demographics are very strong in terms of that growth continuing and having that more nationalists in Northern Ireland than there would be of unionists. So I think the demographics point to a border poll in the next number of years. I think the politics will point to that as well. And I think if there is a Sinn Féin government in Northern Ireland and in the Republic in the next 2 or 3 years, I think we'll see a push that both governments can't turn back, because again, this is about democracy. It's about the people of Ireland who want to make the decision about how they go forward. And we just have to look at the growth, for example, that's happening in the Republic of Ireland. And I think one of the other key things, Brian, to mention as well is, and it comes back to the Brexit point, when we talk about it, we've seen the situation. England voted for Brexit and got it. Wales voted for Brexit and got it. Northern Ireland didn't vote for it, but they've been placed in a special position where they're getting some of the benefits of remaining in the EU, for example. And Scotland is left with none of these, and I think that's a really important point. If it can be done in Northern Ireland with some of these benefits, why can't it be done in Scotland? And again, it's down to the political restrictions of a devolved setup, which isn't fair to the people of Scotland, Northern Ireland, or Wales.
Thank you, Paul. The voice in my ear is really keen for us to move on to the last item, and we really have to. But just before we do go, I would have loved to have had more time to ask you, Paul, about the £3.3 billion package that Stormont's given from the UK government, and whether there's going to be a Barnett consequential from that. But we really do have to move on. So maybe next time. So Culture in an Independent Scotland is a paper that was published by the Scottish Government recently. The paper said that there would be a new Scottish public service broadcaster, but can Scotland become independent without having a fair and balanced independent broadcaster now? I think we here at Broadcasting Scotland would like to cast ourselves in that role, but we've got a short video of when we interviewed Angus Robertson, who is the Cabinet Secretary for the Constitution, External Affairs and Culture, and then we'll come back to discuss this new paper. Here's the video now.
Support for independence or opposition to it is running at about 50-50, but if we look at our media landscape, it is on an editorial basis significantly opposed to Scottish independence. So that's not a real reflection of the fact that there's a balance of views on the issue. When it comes to broadcasting, of course, we want to have impartial journalism that is not down to one side or the other side. We don't have decision making here about broadcasting. We don't have an independent regulatory regime. This is what happens in other countries. At the present time, we subcontract decisions on this to the UK government, who often make bad decisions on our behalf. Let's just do what everybody else does, and let's have the provision of public service broadcasting in Scotland, including the many talented people that currently work here, but within the normal operating setup which exists in other countries.
So that was Broadcasting Scotland interviewing Angus Robertson on the publication of the paper about culture in independent Scotland. I'd really like to, if I had time, I'd mention that in 2020, Broadcasting Scotland put a question to the Scottish Government about universal credit during the pandemic. Universal credit. Maybe Broadcasting Scotland will be able to put a tweet out about it and later, but because we really need to get on to find out what your opinions are. Paul, as you're an SNP MSP, what do you have to say about this new paper?
Obviously support it. It's been a series of papers that have come through in terms of what it's looked like in an independent Scotland, and it kind of comes back to the point we were talking before around about the COVID inquiry, to make sure there's a fair and balanced report. Now, in terms of the press, I think Angus touched on the point that it's roughly 50-50 in terms of support for independence, yet we see probably 95% of the press are hostile to independence and the SNP. In terms of the broadcasting, that you obviously have Ofgem, but you had the situation just about 10 days ago where we had one of the main shows in BBC Radio Scotland, through Kay Adams, where she referred to saying around about politicians not being people. The politicians, they're not people, and we've seen, and without a huge amount of kickback from the BBC in that, and if you're getting the main broadcaster and the main show on BBC Radio Scotland, and you've got presenters saying things like that and thinking that's acceptable, it's not. And we don't have a balanced press. We don't have, I think, have a balanced broadcast system in terms of that. We, as a very minimum, as part of our wider culture, Scotland needs to get control in an evolved Scotland over broadcasting, as it should be at the moment. But certainly within an independent Scotland, I welcome the paper. Culture is incredibly important in terms of how a country is seen overseas and it sees itself. And the BBC doesn't provide that service, and the press certainly don't. So I welcome the paper, and hopefully it'll kick off some proper discussion around about where we see broadcasting in Scotland and the current devolved settlement, but also within where it should be within an independent country.
Thank you, Paul. And Anthony, my apologies, because this leaves us very little time for you to contribute. But just very quickly, the report said that it recommended joining organisations such as Creative Europe and UNESCO, and recommended or supports festivals like Celtic Connections and the Fringe, and also just free-to-air Scottish football games. Have you had a chance to look at the report?
Yes, so in my sort of however many seconds I have, my 20 seconds, 30 seconds, whatever, sure, culture and broadcasting, of course, are quite important elements to the independence debate. And frankly, if I were sort of an SNP minister, I would want sort of broadcasting devolved as sort of my top priority far more than anything else, right? Because, having the opportunity for more distinct Scottish broadcasting, and of course in addition to independent outlets like Broadcasting Scotland right here, that provides a space for more local content with the local editorial knowledge, which I think is quite important. Sometimes people can have different views on whether other broadcasters and journalists, both within Scotland or indeed from other parts of the UK, particularly in the London bubble, whether or not they are genuinely disparaging of sort of people who support independence or the ideas of independence, or does it in part reflect their lack of knowledge of Scottish politics, Scottish history, and so forth. And of course, if you have more local outlets, then there's a greater chance, a greater prospect and opportunities for the kind of independent and impartial journalism which well serves any functioning democracy. So I can certainly see the benefits for that. I can see what I presume Angus was alluding to in terms of other jurisdictions than in other parts of the world. Sort of telecommunications, broadcasting, and so on are sort of devolved or decentralized, depending on whatever the technical term is in those countries or those states. And sure, you can see that Germany, I suppose, is an example. Of course, the United States for sure. Where there's some federal oversight, but in the main, local licensing by the federal states in Germany or elsewhere, and provides an opportunity for local content for local situations. I think that makes sense. On the wider points, sure, yeah, you can try to be part of Creative Europe or UNESCO and so on. They're important institutions where it makes sense and it's possible to be part of them. and always worth considering the role of culture in society.
Thank you, Anthony. And just one final thing, Paul, maybe the next time you bump into Angus Robertson, maybe you could just say that we were a wee bit disappointed that he didn't take the opportunity to give Broadcasting Scotland a shout out when in the paper. But please tell him that he'd be welcome on here anytime if he can ever spare the
Brian,
time.
he's 2 doors away from me in the Parliament, so I'll see him probably on Tuesday and I'll mention that to him.
Okay. Please do. So that's it for this week's Full Scottish. But before I go, I just wanted to remind you that here at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. So to everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, we thank you very much. You know that our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month or anything at all, please do consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. We are still £2,000 short of our £10,000 target. Although the pressure has been eased, we still need to raise that £2,000 to pay our bills. So we can then focus on securing the future of independent broadcasting for Scotland by growing our subscriber base and regular funding. But just once again, thank you to my guests, to Anthony and to Paul. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for giving up a huge chunk of your weekend. We really appreciate it. And thank you for your patience with me as well in my mispronunciations and my stumbling questions. But thank you and goodbye. Bye, and thank you for watching.